Do you call that a deconstitution, baby? Basically, baby.
There's different words.
That word came out wrong. Do you call that a deconstitution, baby? That's not what I meant to say.
I thought you said maybe.
No.
Maybe. So, no. Welcome back to Reason Together, the podcast for Christians who think about stuff, for episode 180. We are knocking
Fantastic.
on 200 episodes before long, but we're glad to have you, dear listener, with us along for this one. I'm here, as always, with my good friend, Pastor Daniel Fox. Good to see you this morning.
Yeah, likewise.
Hey, before we get too much further into the conversation today, we do want to thank our patrons over at patreon.com/reasontogether. That is, if you're unfamiliar with it, a place where podcast listeners and really any other listeners or consumers of creative content can support works that they enjoy listening to. And we have a number of really faithful and loyal supporters over there that help us pay our editors.
We do.
That take care of the blog and the website and the audio of this podcast. And we're grateful for them. And you guys help support them as patrons of Reason Together podcast. If you'd like to join up and help support this, you can go over to patreon.com/reasontogether and pick one of the various support levels there, and you get some perks out of that. We just had a podcast listener become an elite patron yesterday.
Yes, we did.
So welcome, Sydney, to the patron family.
That's right.
We're glad to have you on board.
Welcome aboard. Thank you so much. Yeah. It's neat. We just kind of see a faithful, it seems like a regular, increase of patrons. Not 5 a day, but I mean, it's just, I appreciate the ones that just decide to sign on and get on the bandwagon here. Thanks.
Thank you, Sydney. Appreciate that. Sydney's a good dude, so good to have you along. All right. I sound a little different here this morning, don't I?
Yeah, you do. At least to me, and I probably to them a little bit.
Yeah, so I'm in a different room here.
Because he's in a different state.
Yes.
Yep.
You and I are actually in the same time zone at the moment.
Whoa. Yeah. Really?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Oh, you are now. Okay.
We are. Okay. We used to have to coordinate these episodes with different time zones, but now we're in the same time zone.
Yes.
No. But there's a reason for that, I suppose.
There is, and that will be really the meat and potatoes of our episode today. Is talking about Tom's recent move and what led him to it. I was thinking about this episode coming up to it, and I thought about, so I'll just throw it out there, but honestly, and then I go, oh, I cringe at this joke at my own. Can you imagine that? Me cringing at my own joke? But I was, you could.
I would imagine it, but I've seen you do it, so I don't have to imagine my very much. Joke.
But I just thought, it really draws the attention. A lot of clicks if you say, Tom has transitioned, given the current political climate. No, but I know it's like he now identifies as He-Man or something like that. I don't know. No, anyway. That's a stupid joke. And so, Rosby, feel free to edit that one out and and put the intelligent filter on me. And no, actually.
Well, no, you can leave it in, and I'll say why, because that's a good point to make, that there is an entire cultural movement of people in this country that have ruined good words.
Oh, that's a good point. They just start redefining and hacking things to pieces until things are unintelligible, kind of, right?
Right. Well, it's like there's certain words you just have to stop using anymore because it always brings up something in someone's mind. And that word transition has come up in this move, because when you move from one state to another, you are transitioning to a different phase of life, a different chapter. And Pastor Dietrich, our mutual mentor, has said that, and talking with me about it, he kept saying, until your transition is complete. And every time he would say that, I would think in my mind, oh, that word, it's just, that word. It's been so misused and
Right.
so misappropriated now that it just sounds weird. But for all of you listening, if you hear that Tom has transitioned, as Pastor Fox has said, all that means is I've moved from Connecticut to another place. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Mm,
but more than that, it has meant for you in some ways a vocational change, right?
yeah.
Not
Hmm.
a heart change, but as far as the heart to serve, but a vocational change to some degree.
Right.
Uh, you were trivocational, I think, at least, and now you're only bivocational.
Um, yeah. Oh, these words. These
Yeah,
words. Why do they have to be so weird now? Why can't they just be normal words?
yeah.
Um, yeah, no, I was trivocational when I lived in Connecticut because I was pastoring a church that we had planted, and I was working in a surgical center, and I was running a small business. So I guess that's three vocations.
Mm-hmm.
Here, um, I I really I only have one. I guess you'd say.
Yeah, the shop isn't opened up yet, but
Not yet, and I might not reopen it. I don't know. It just kind of depends on how things go.
yeah, yeah,
Listeners are probably listening, going, "What is he talking about? How did he end up there? What?" It's probably
yeah,
news to all of you listening. Um, but just to kind of set the record straight, we've moved to Tennessee,
yeah,
and
yep.
this is a new chapter for our family, and this would be a scary thing if the Lord was not in it. I mean, seriously, I would be terrified doing what we did here if the Lord was not in it, because so much of it was happened so quickly, and um, there were decisions in it that people might look at and go, "Boy, that seems kind of risky." But a decision is not risky when you know that the Lord is in it. And I'll tell you, we've just been so blessed. I was telling you last week when we were up there, maybe it was you I was talking to about this. I was saying I almost feel spoiled. Um, the Lord has just showered so many blessings on us in such a short period of time.
Hmm.
It's like concentrated blessings, and it's almost overwhelming. And um, that I guess that kind of helps when you're doing something that
Yeah,
people might
sure.
think is a little bit scary, but the Lord is in it. It helps when the Lord just showers blessings on you and you go, wow, he really must be in this. So,
Good, good. Well, to give a little, now I imagine that many people that listen to the podcast are somewhat aware of your background and where you had been here for the last decade almost. But some might just be tuning in and you're wondering, who are these guys? What are they talking about? Tom, about 10 years, 9 years ago, right? I think it
yeah, somewhere in there.
was was sent out of our church here in Missouri to plant a church, or sent out from our church to Connecticut, and his family went there and rooted there, and be and faithfully sowed seed in a difficult place, and you saw people reached. You led people to the
Hmm.
Lord, and that is a neat thing. And then if I maybe I'm moving too fast, Tom, but I want to kind of mention it, and then we'll kind of we'll step back and talk about the details. But then just felt that the Lord, through several different whatever you want to say, messages, through several means, was indicating the work that I wanted you to do here is done. And so then Tom, in a short period of time, recognizing what the Lord was doing, um, did some research and ended up moving. And so that's largely what we're talking about. But that doesn't come without a lot of questions. Not only questions on Tom's part, but questions on the part of other people too. And
Yeah.
we hope to maybe address some of that today, because I think it would be a help to those who have uh, either been in ministry or not been in ministry, just to have maybe a proper perspective.
Well, and even those who might be considering ministry.
Yeah. Yep.
I
Good.
think
Good
it's
thought.
important for them to hear stories like this. I hope that doesn't sound self-aggrandizing, but um, I think people going into ministry need to be aware of some things about exiting a ministry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's some things you should be warned about, or at least cognizant of before you go into ministry. So maybe it'll be of help, maybe it won't. I don't know. But
Yeah. But here we go.
here we go.
So why don't you start off in any of this that you feel like you don't want to share? It's too personal. Don't. Um, but I guess first of all, I'll just say that of course I know you closer than most. So I had a little bit of a closer view to what was going on. Um, but if you know Tom is a worker, and so he was working, like we said, trivocationally, um, but working to invest in the lives of people alongside of a couple jobs that he was working. Of course, he's preparing to preach. What were some steps that you had taken in the community to try to connect with people? Let's just kind of go back that far.
Oh man, I'm almost tired just thinking about it. The traditional means of reaching an area with the gospel, at least in our circles and in recent generations, has been to knock on doors and talk to people at their doorstep, or sometimes just simply blitz an area and hang things on doorknobs and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all fine and good. If that is useful in your area, great, good on you. I will say this without any reservation whatsoever: it is well nigh worthless to do that in the neighborhood that we lived in.
Mm-hmm.
It
People just really didn't like standing at their door talking to a stranger.
No,
Yep.
not at all.
Right.
Not at all. They hate it. You're viewed as a predator. You're viewed suspiciously, and there's no way that in that 5-minute interaction, if you get an interaction, that someone is going to just bow their knee to the Lord Jesus Christ in that moment, unless by some wildly intervening circumstances they've already been led of the Lord in some way to be studying the gospel and looking and searching for truth. And then all of a sudden, just by providence, you show up at their door. That, in my experience, is a very rare scenario in the area we lived. Maybe it's more common in some other places, but not where we lived.
In 9 years, did you ever see that happen?
Never.
Never. Okay. So
in fact, in 9 years of ministry there, we never saw a single visitor, a single prospect that was positive, a single decision, if I can use the word, for salvation, hardly ever even a positive response at all.
From that method.
Yeah.
Okay. So how did you connect or get into homes then?
We did a lot of mailings. Again, it's another way where you sort of feel like you're throwing your money away as a church, but you want to. It's not just about seeing results; it's about actually giving your due diligence. Is what it's about. So, whether you see the results knocking on doors or not, or mailings, there are things you need to do so that you have done your due diligence. And mailings was another one of those things. So. We sent out thousands, maybe tens of thousands in the years that we were there of mailings. Some of them were just invitations. Some of them we actually printed our gospel tracts right on them. That one got the worst response ever.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yes.
Invitation, not so bad. Gospel, stop filling my mailbox with this stuff.
Right.
Okay.
I would get angry letters sent to us. I had letters that were meticulously crafted, pages long, attempting to refute what we were teaching. I got voicemails left on the church phone line, where someone was like a Satan worshiper, and they're like hissing and cursing and angry, not exaggerating at all, literally hissing, like making weird sounds. We had all sorts of strange occurrences happen with trying to reach the people in that town. And we were not the first church plant to ever attempt there. We were the fourth attempted independent Baptist church plant in the city of Norwich, Connecticut.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and the three prior to us eventually left or fizzled out in one way or another, or the pastor moved and the church kind of dissolved, similar to our situation. But all that to say, those are some of the more maybe common methods that we use was knocking on doors or blitzing areas and sending out mailings.
Otherwise, I can say that through, if you will, life experience, basically by doing something with people, you use that as an avenue of building a relationship and then being an influence, i.e., at your other job, at the
Sure.
Surgeon Center, or, because obviously you're working alongside these people, so you're being salt to them there.
Yeah.
And honestly, you were that here before you left. When you worked at a hospital here, I think you were an influence there, right? You had conversations, gospel conversations, if you will, there. So you used that avenue of the people that you worked with, and then you joined an MMA gym, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. That was one of the things that we did for outreach. And even before getting to that, we had other public events that we would do, because that's another common means that churches reach out with public events.
Okay. Yes.
So we would have like Friend Day, it's called. And some churches will do that. It's just an excuse to invite people to church. So we would do Friend Day. I'm sure we had others that I can't think of at the moment. One of the things we did was a public Q&A.
Yeah, I recall that now that you mention it.
Yeah, we did it for 4 Wednesday nights, and we invited people from the general public to come and ask questions, and really anything. And I'll tell you, I got some good questions. I even had, believe it or not, a question about canonicity when we were there.
Yeah,
During that. A skeptic who didn't believe the Bible wanted to know how it is we can call a book written by man and compiled by man, quote unquote, the word of God. So that was a good question.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So that was one means of outreach we did. But yeah, it mostly in our area, it came down to personal relationships with people. That became the most fruitful means for us. The mixed martial arts gym was basically one of two choices. I was either going to go to the community college and start taking classes and try to be a witness in the classroom to students and to professors and things. And it was between that and joining an MMA gym. So I went with the MMA gym. And I'm so glad I did. I'm so glad I did. It was a good experience. I did that for 6 years there, and it became the most fertile ground for conversations about the gospel. Nearly every class that I took there, when the class was over, I'd end up standing out in the parking lot talking with someone about the things of God and or giving a tract. And we had the most visitors we've ever had in all the years that we were there. Pretty much all the visitors we had that were prospective folks were from the gym there.
Wow.
Yeah. And there was, in fact, I don't want to spoil the story too much by getting too far ahead, but it did result in one man coming to know Christ eventually. After probably closer to 7 years. A man that I knew from the gym there reached out to me and came to the church to meet with me and talk with about some things. And long story short, he ended up trusting Christ and is fruit that remains.
Praise the Lord. Good.
So, but we never saw that from door to door. Never saw that from the mailings or anything. It was from personal relationships. Go ahead.
Describe the city's perspective as you were trying to find a building or establish a location outside of, say, just you began in a hotel, correct? A hotel conference room,
correct?
And then
banquet hall, yep.
And in trying to establish something a little more permanent, maybe describe a little bit of the roadblocks you had there.
Sure. I mean, to say it in the most colloquial sense possible, they hated my guts. um, they wanted nothing to do with our church, and I don't know how they knew about us that much. I mean, they have churches that come and go in that town all the time, little tabernacles of deliverance and praise, Pentecostal churches like that,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and little pop ups here and there that start. A lot of them start without seeking the city's approval at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which is one of the things the zoning manager told me, the zoning officer. And that kind of didn't put churches in good graces with the town to begin with, but they would let them in. They would still let them in. And when it came to our attempt, we were trying to get out of that banquet hall and get into a more permanent place. And I would go before the zoning officer. I got to know her personally. She's not currently the zoning officer there anymore, but I would come in and I'd say, "How about this area?" And she said, "Nope, churches aren't allowed there." And then a few weeks would go by and some little church would pop up there. Some new Pentecostal or non-denominational or Southern Baptist thing from down south. That the SBC was doing things like that. They would send people up there to start these churches, and they would start them as non-denominational. And buried deep on their website would be a link somewhere at the bottom in tiny print to the SBC. So that they would start up no problem. They'd have no trouble getting into whatever area of town they wanted to. And for us, we just kept getting denied. It was unfair enough that I contacted the Christian Law Association and I asked them, can they do this? How is it that they can
totally
just zone us out like that?
Yeah.
And he said, unfortunately, the way that it's written, they can do that. But we were left without recourse there, without getting a permanent place to meet. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, this big castle church, it was called, started right in the downtown area, right smack in the center of it, when we were always told churches weren't allowed there. And I asked them, what about getting a variance and having like a public hearing? They said, nope, it's not even allowed to do that. That's what I was told. And then some Universalist Unitarian church started up a few doors down from that. So it's like it was unfairly applied. But anyway, all that to say, we eventually got a space, but it was in the next town over, right on the border.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, yeah. So essentially could be local, but just right over the border into the next.
Exactly.
Next
so, and I think that frustrated some of our supporters for a while because they're like, oh, what did he give up in Norwich and move to the next town? No, we still continued our ministry in Norwich just like we always had. It's just our meeting place was just over the line in Basra, next door to Norwich. And Basra would let you do pretty much anything. So that gave us our meeting spot.
I'm curious, maybe a side question here, is how effective do you feel like your website was to what you were doing there? How important is it to have a nice website? Because I could see a young church planter going out and feeling like he's got this list of all the methodologies, right? He's got to have a good website. He's got to do this. He's got to do that. He's got to do that in order to be a success. Was that part of the success that you had?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by effective and what you mean by success. So when it comes to a website, it will effectuate visitors. It will make them feel more comfortable coming.
Because you look more legitimate.
Oh, yeah, sure. But that doesn't necessarily translate to fruit.
Right.
It almost never does. It just results in visitors coming who are surprised that your church is so small and so, informal, I guess, because we had a professional looking website. So people would often be surprised when they'd come and we're meeting in a storefront. We didn't have our own building or steeple or anything, and there'd be less than 50 people there. And, people were often surprised by that because the website looked so nice.
So, I mean, there is a value to it in just demonstrate, and I think it's one of those things, if you do it right, do it well, so that it doesn't speak poorly of you that, oh, look at this old hick website, it looks like it was built in the 80s, or whatever.
Yeah, I still get emails from folks looking for missionary support, and the links to their sending churches sometimes are embarrassing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It looks like, early, mid to late 90s websites with clip art and pixelated graphics and all sorts of
Mm-hmm.
weird little, flash things. It's like, do better.
Yeah, it's just a thing that could be cleaned up and made to look more professional and a better reflection of what the church is.
Right.
Oh, okay, good. So you got there. These are the ways that you connected. These are some of the difficulties that you faced. Certainly, the cost of living was high or higher.
Yeah.
Was it higher than where you're living now?
As far as like groceries, you're not going to see a whole lot of difference.
Okay.
Gas prices, maybe a small difference. Yeah, you're not going to see it too much there. Where you're going to see it is in the taxes.
Okay. Sure.
So we paid, I think it was over $9,000 a year in taxes.
Oh my.
Between real estate, personal property, those two things.
Yeah.
So yeah, the taxes hit us hard there. Whereas I think where we are now in Tennessee, it's like $2,000 a year.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. And I guess I want to ask something about the political climate. Not sure where to go, but I just saying. I guess obviously there's a connection where in the Northeast it's more stereotypically liberal, at least, right? That does also probably go hand in hand with a religious coldness. Would I be right in that?
Yeah, I would say so. And it's going to differ even by towns. So there might be
Okay.
people listening who are from Connecticut and they're like, I don't think my state's all that liberal. Well, it may just be your town. We
Mm-hmm.
noticed a dramatic difference from town to town. So, for instance, Basra, where the church ended up being, was a little more hick. It was a little more country. And I use that term loosely. Where you live in Missouri, Basra would not have been considered country, but for Connecticut, it was.
Right.
And it kind of has a reputation as being a little bit redneck. Lebanon was the same way. There's an area up by Lebanon, very country up there.
Mm-hmm.
And then the further you go towards Massachusetts, that corner of Connecticut is very spread out and wooded. But like, for instance, Basra and Norwich, right next to each other, very different feel to them.
Yeah.
Norwich was very liberal feeling. And we were in with the people. We knew the people. We were known in town, and they knew us. We knew them. Much more politically left leaning. Whereas if you go into Basra, is a little more right leaning.
Okay.
So.
Now talk about, and if we're skipping something, feel free to say so. But when you felt like this is God is done with us here, what were the steps that you took to transition the ministry? I mean, you didn't just
Sure.
you didn't just announce, I'm done, gone, I'm moving, but
Right.
you felt the responsibility to deal with these sheep, and of course you have 50 loose ends as far as the building and this and this and this. So tell me some of the steps that you took.
Well, first let me talk about the phrase "when God is done." So when you shut down a ministry, it's not people. There's a stigma to it.
Sure.
So. And the decision to close down a ministry is harder, way harder than the decision to start one. Because when you close down a ministry, you're going to be dealing with the unfair scrutiny, unfair prejudgment or prejudice of a lot of people who are in our circles that know you're conducting ministry there. They're going to immediately suspect something bad happened. They're going to immediately suspect anything from as simple as you're a quitter all the way to you you sinned some immoral thing and disqualified yourself.
And
They're
had to
going to
leave.
think,
Yeah.
yeah, and had to leave. They're going to think all sorts of evil things of you because I don't know how your experience is, but in my experience in Baptist circles for much of my life, most of my life, and in fundamentalist circles for basically my adult life, there's very little 1 Corinthians 13 love for each other. So as soon as something happens, we think evil. Love thinketh no evil, charity thinketh no evil. So that doesn't happen a lot. So people immediately think something bad happened. And when someone asks me now, why did you leave Connecticut? My answer is this: mission accomplished. God was done with us there. The mission was finished.
Okay.
And we did what he wanted us to do.
Now, can I pause there and
Sure.
say you went there to, quote, plant a church, end quote. Now, what do you think God was doing in hindsight?
Well, I know now that God's intent was not to establish a church.
And by establish, you mean long term?
Yeah. What I mean is, what people have in their mind of the American idea of an established church. So it has its own building. It has its, a bunch of programs. It has maybe its own van or bus, and it brings in thousands and thousands of dollars a month. $multi-million a year ministry.
Self-supported pastor.
Self-supported pastor. Where they're paying him a full-time salary that he can subsist on. That sort of thing. And it's full of established people. That's not what God had in mind. I thought that's what God had in mind to begin with. And many times the Lord only shows us a little bit ahead, sort of like the headlights on our car. Yeah. And where the headlights were shining a decade ago, what we saw was, God wants us to establish a church. What we know now is that God does not intend to establish a church in every place. Not even the Apostle Paul was able to establish a church in every place that he went. And we don't often give him short shrift as a failure for those attempts in those places. Did he do what God called him to do? Yes. Did he see some degree of fruit in those places? Yes. Were those local people made more responsible before God for their rejection of him? Yes. All of those things were accomplished with our ministry in Connecticut.
Okay, good. And of course, your reference to were the local people made more responsible would be, validated by the passage in the Gospels where Jesus said, "Woe unto thee, Chorazin, Bethsaida," right? Because the idea that you've seen something other people have not seen, thus your judgment will be greater. You've had, as we would often say, a greater degree of light, which you have responded negatively toward.
Right. And that's a good phrase. And that maybe is the most succinct answer to your question, is that the mission God sent us on there was to be light bringers.
Good.
We brought the light of the gospel there. Most of the people we dealt with rejected it. And that's okay. That is not a bad result. People are freaking out listening to that because they're like, wait, shouldn't they have been saved? I mean, that's you mean it's not a bad result that they didn't get saved? No, it's actually not. And maybe from the human perspective, that's a bad result because we want to see everybody get saved and we love people and so on. But the fact is, if someone rejects God and they stand before him someday and they receive their judgment, God's attribute of justice is enacted in that individual. And God receives glory for his attribute of justice, just as much as he receives glory for his attribute of grace. So you have to understand, when people reject you and your ministry, you are not a failure.
Right. Yeah. And that's a good thing to soak in.
Otherwise, we would have to say that Jesus was a failure too.
And I remember the passage in Peter where it says, "The Lord is not willing that any should perish." Does he want them to deny and to be judged?
No.
He wants to redeem them to himself. But
sure.
But
my point is that he is just as And people might freak out. He is just as satisfied with his attribute of justice.
And he's glorified still by their response one way or the other. And I think
Yes.
the practical application of that is what you said, is that if you go and you bear light and you're a consistent, accurate representation of the Lord, and they reject it, no,
Yeah.
it's not a failure to
Mm-mm.
you. It's you
No.
have done what you should. And
Well, I told someone the other day about this, and their response was they looked at me with a sad face and said, "I'm sorry."
meaning,
As if
I'm sorry it
I,
turned out that way.
yeah, like I had told them that we moved from Connecticut and we shut down the ministry work there, and they said, "I'm sorry," as if someone had died. Like the response would have been no different as if I had told them that I just lost a parent,
Mm-hmm.
and they're like, "I'm sorry," and I told them, I said, "You don't have to be sorry.
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
mission was accomplished, and there is fruit that remains there in Connecticut, and there are people who will be in heaven one day because of the ministry that we had there. That's what God wanted, and the rest will be
Mm-hmm.
held responsible for their rejection. That
Yeah.
is what God wanted. There's no reason to be sorry." And he was
Um,
like, "Oh, well, okay, I hadn't thought of it that way."
yeah. Yeah. Well, and partly maybe he's feeling that you would be sad that you were, well, maybe, yeah, the thought that you felt like you had failed because
Yeah.
you didn't accomplish
Well,
what you had originally thought you might.
well,
Let me,
what makes me sad is not the fact that we left. What makes me sad is that most people in our circles view that as a failure when it isn't.
yes, right, right. Um, Looking at, yeah, obviously, we would all do things differently to a point if we knew now what we could know in the future. But let me ask you, when you think about your original presentations to churches, I'm Tom Belzamo, this is my family, and we're going to Norwich, Connecticut to fill in the blank. Um, would you verbalize your intentions differently if you knew what you know now?
I would verbalize it differently.
Okay.
I wouldn't do anything differently.
Right, right.
Um,
So what would it how would it sound different?
um, well, let me back up a little bit. There may be a couple things I would do differently, which I'll get to in a minute. But the way that I would say it differently is that God would be leading us to Norwich, Connecticut, to bring the light of the gospel.
Good. I think often the typical presentation, correct me if I'm wrong, you've been in more conferences than I have, I mean missions conferences, is I'm called to plant a church, or I'm
Mm-hmm.
called to this country and we're going to plant a church, disciple the believers, blah, blah, blah. And they kind of lay out a 3, step thing for, starting a school and whatever. And and that, of course, that's their goal. And I can understand
Yeah.
that. However, they may not be taking into account that may not materialize there. So they're sort of stating that intention, do they sort of
Yeah.
set themselves up for potential feeling of failure if they don't?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. But unless you say it that way, fat chance getting support.
Mm.
So I'll tell you a personal story here. When we first started raising support, and we raised about 65% of the needed support that we needed when we went to the field. So we went on deputation for a little bit. That was what we were counseled to do by a pastor in Connecticut in a different part of the state. So we took his advice and we raised support. And one of the first deputation meetings that we had, I remember it was a church in Pennsylvania, and the pastor there's a personal friend of mine, and we still keep in touch. So if you're listening to this, you might remember this story. You might know who you are. But it was kind of a funny thing that happened, because in my mind, I was being called to bring the light of the gospel to Connecticut. So I gave a presentation to the pastor and the men of the church separately. It wasn't even to the entire church yet. And the plans that I had laid out were basically about how we would reach out and everything and such. And he asked, so what's your plan? And in my mind, I'm thinking, how do I answer this? Because I just told him my plan. I'm going there to give the gospel to people. And what he wanted to hear was, what are the steps you're laying out to start a church? Because it's viewed in our circles that if you don't have a plan for starting a church, then you're not to be taken seriously. You kind of just are wishy-washy or whatever. Now, ultimately, the goal of seeing people saved is to see a church established.
Right, sure.
But it is something that I believe now, looking back, happens more organically than it does in a forced way or contrived way. So we did the traditional thing where you have an opening day and you promote it and you canvass the whole town and all that. I would not do it that way again. In fact, when you think about it, it's kind of stupid. It's sort of a mass marketing approach to planting a church. But I had read some manual on church planting that said to do it that way. A much better way to do it would be simply put someone on the ground in the place, have that person give the gospel as a way of life and support them while they do that. And as people get saved and baptized and discipled, they begin to meet together over time. Maybe it's in their living room. Maybe it's in a friend's house. Maybe it's in a storefront, whatever it might be. But it's much more organic that way. But when you try to plant a church where you have this established looking thing from day one and just invite people to it, it isn't right. It just isn't right. It's not, first of all, it's not a biblical method, in my opinion. I know that now. But when you raise support, you have to almost do it the wrong way. Otherwise, people won't take you seriously.
I recall a missions trip here 10, 11, I guess it was 11 years ago now, 11 or 12. And we had the privilege of going to both Kenya and Uganda, Africa. And really was a tremendous trip. And in that time, we spent quite a bit of time with if you want to say veteran missionary there that had been there for a number of years, but admitted that as we started, we were trying maybe one way, and we've come to realize a more effective way. And as he shared that, it's sounding similar to what you're saying. He would train a man to go, say, into his village and to evangelize and have Bible studies. And he said, don't meet on Sunday. Don't call it church. This is a Bible study, and as you see people saved, and then, he'd go through that, and then he would train him to the next step. Okay, now you need to do this. And then as a white man, he would only show up with him a few times, maybe for the official constituting of the church. But the perspective of the white man was so toxic in the sense that white is money. And so he tried to keep detached from as much as possible, but train them along that process. But he was saying something similar in that you don't go find the building first and then invite, you go and you win people, then you begin to study with them, and then eventually you constitute a church. Are you saying that your thought is similar even on American soil, that philosophy should be considered?
I think it should be. I think it should be. But we have a completely backwards and skewed view of what a church even is in most Baptist circles today. We envision this place that's established and has a steeple and has programs and it's full of people and all that. And unfortunately, unsaved people in America think the same. So if you invite them to something and it doesn't look like an established church, they're more awkward about it. So in a sense, a more holistic approach, a more organic approach would be literally just one person at a time as you see them saved and baptized and discipled, or even not baptized yet. I would say you could even delay the baptism until you've got more folks together, so that there are witnesses and so on, until you've constituted. But as far as and I'm sure there's probably some people freaking out at that thought too. But the idea should be more organic. It should be more from the ground up, rather than this approach of you got to just blitz the whole area and say, we have a church here now and you ought to come to it. Well, no, we don't have a church yet.
If it's just you and your family, you're saying.
Well, I mean, Not to be pedantic, I do think that can constitute a church when you're
Mm-hmm.
looking to start a new work.
Mm-hmm.
If your family are believers, then you can meet together
Oh, I see.
as a
Yeah.
church when you're looking to bring other people into it.
But even if you have
Um,
a couple families, your family and those couple families, do represent a small church.
right.
So, okay. I have another question here to ask, and we can keep talking. Do you want to roll over into the after show here, or?
Yeah, in fact, I mean, maybe we can do it a little different because we didn't get very far. We can just roll right into the after show now and just make it a free episode. We do that from time to time.
Okay.
Is we offer an episode of the after show for free.
Yep.
So, I mean, I say we just go right into it.
Okay.
Make it a longer episode.
Okay, I want to jump back just to highlight something to our listeners that when you went there, as you had said, there had been attempts in the past. It was a difficult region. That's another subject in a sense. But something that came to mind as you were talking was that your church, and you did plant a church,
Mm-hmm.
were largely first generation Christians. Am I right?
Yes, I would say so. So there's one lady that I think may have been saved sometime prior to us knowing her, but her husband for sure was not, by his own admission. Um, and there were several other folks. I don't want to give too many details over
Yeah,
the
yeah,
internet
yeah.
about their
No.
life, but but basically, by the time we left Connecticut, all the people that remained with our church were folks that were saved and baptized and discipled under our ministry.
Neat. And I had to say, there's some of the names I don't know that I had met a few early on several years back, but as you would share, it's like my heart was blessed by them. I don't even know their face. I just knew their name,
Mhm.
that they were faithful and that they were growing, and
Mhm.
that you know what I mean. And so if they happen to listen to this episode, I would want them to know that they're, some of them have been a blessing to me just in hearing of them,
Yeah.
and the blessing they were to you.
Yeah, they were an incredible blessing to me. I would take a bullet for any one of them. And there was a love and a kinship that we had amongst ourselves by the time that we left.
Now we would say that there, we could highlight obviously the difficulties of planting especially a first generation church, a first generation Christian church. But what highlight for me some of the blessings of planting a church, of being the one who who determines the direction and the steps, and takes all that. What's the you're not just a guy who came in as the fifth generation pastor, right, to continue and to steer the ship, but you're kind of building the ship.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what's the blessing of that?
Well, the blessing is your independence. If you're
From
talking just from a purely administrative standpoint, you have the
okay,
blessing of not having to, dare I say, undo.
right, do it the way that everybody else always done it.
Right, right. And I know pastors who have done this where they come into a church that they candidate at a place. They've never been there really before, but they're candidating there, and the people don't know him and he doesn't know them, and he ends up taking the church, and it turns out he does things totally different from what the
Yeah.
people have been used to. And uh, I don't. I hope this isn't crass, but the people that will give you the hardest time as a pastor are the people with experience. Um, in the years that we were in Connecticut, the people that gave me the most grief are people that were experienced from other churches. No, I'm not kidding. Those were the people. Those are the people that stirred up trouble. Those are the people that had weird doctrinal views. Those are the people who thought they were smart and weren't. Those are the people that caused the most grief and heartache, and some of them even nearly split the church. I mean, unbelievable grief. And meanwhile, you have these folks who didn't have much of a church background, or maybe they had limited church background.
Mm-hmm.
And they came to us and got saved and discipled and so on. And they were just the biggest blessing in the world.
And they're listening to the preaching, they're growing, they're
Yeah.
they're taking what you're feeding them,
Yeah.
but
And
without.
that's actually the second blessing I was going to mention
Okay,
is
okay.
when someone gets it. That's the biggest blessing to my heart as a pastor, was to see when someone gets it. So, like I said earlier, the people that we had when we left Connecticut in our church, the most wonderful, sweet-spirited group of people that I think any pastor would give, his left arm to
Mm-hmm.
have people like these in their church. And these were relatively newer Christians. And they would, during the week, re-listen to the sermons, like
Yeah.
more than once sometimes.
Wow.
They would read in personal Bible study and then ask questions about what they read during the week.
Mm-hmm.
They would lead their kids in Bible studies and teach their kids the Word of God, trying to lead their kids to Christ. I mean, I'm serious. It was the biggest blessing to see when people just latched onto it. And you could also see too when it would click for them, when they would finally realize, hey, you know what? I can understand the Bible. It's just a matter of knowing how to study it. And when preaching is done a certain way, it actually is giving people the ammunition to then study it themselves too.
Yeah, and you're showing them a template, giving them a template. Here's how you do it.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it, a template. That's what they would get in the preaching, is a template for study.
Mm-hmm.
So then they would study during the week, and they'd text me questions or email me questions throughout the week. Or they'd tell me about some instance they had where they were talking with someone about the gospel or the Bible. And I mean, you just couldn't ask for better.
Yeah, neat.
So
Good. Any others that you want to mention before I ask you the next question?
others,
Any
what do you mean?
other blessings?
Other blessings? Those are the two big ones that come to mind, is just that, you have the independence of
Mm-hmm.
not having to undo someone else's work.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the blessing when people really latch onto the scriptures and they start to get it.
Yes.
That's it.
Yeah. And then I was going to ask, so, and I think we had touched on this before, but maybe not taken it fully through. What steps did you take to transition the church itself, the people, for your departure? What steps did you take?
So I spent a while explaining to them sort of what is important in a church.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, I was kind of preaching to the choir at that point. I think they knew what makes a good church. I had
Intuitively, without having a list, they just sort of sensed our church is a
Right.
good church. And
Right. I had spent an enormous amount of time and energy in the preaching,
mm-hmm.
uh, woven through in pieces here and there, attempting to lay a groundwork for how to identify good preaching, good pastors, good churches, good Christians, good processes. And they would pick it up. I didn't like preach like one sermon on the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
I would stick it in bits and pieces. Here's why we do this way. That would be one point of a message, is explaining why we do it this way, or why shouldn't it be done the way we commonly see it, or so on. And I'd weave it through there. So that was part of it, and that was deliberate. And another thing is that by the time I was leaving there, I did preach an entire message, essentially is an encouraging message, not so much a teaching message, but an encouraging message that you are prepared. You know what to do. When you identify this in a church, in a pastor in the future, you know what to look for. So trying to just tell them and give them a feeling of strength that we can discern this.
Yeah, they don't have to be dependent on
tools.
you to say, here's the man to go to, but to say you have the ability to discern. You have a discernment.
Right. And I did contact another pastor in the state about 40 minutes away, which by Connecticut standards is a long commute. So I was a little concerned. Are they going to be willing to make this commute to church 40 minutes away? And the reason why I set up a relationship with this man before all of this happened is because he was very like-minded with what we believe and how we do things. He has a very biblical philosophy of ministry. And there were closer churches to us in Connecticut that I could have referred our people to, but I would never join them myself. So some of the churches near us were very extreme in certain areas. So one big
doctrinally
extremity,
or practically?
both.
Okay.
Both. So like I'm thinking of some churches in our area that, we're big soul winning churches, and meanwhile they don't really understand biblical soul winning. They don't even understand biblical repentance, and yet they're a soul winning church. I could not in good conscience recommend our people go to a place like that, because often hand in hand, what you get with that is places where the preaching is just sort of boisterous and hollow, and a lot of hot air, and some moral truths from a few Bible verses, but no real meat. All sizzle and no steak, as they say. And I did not want to recommend our people to a church like that. And so I think our people would have actually been quite uncomfortable with that. They knew by that point that that's just kind of sanctified entertainment. That's kind of showy, but it's not real meaty. They understood that.
Okay.
And there were some other churches that had different extremes. So like one church, was sort of very, very libertine in their leanings. So very flashy and showy, and their music was very kind of contemporary leaning, very blended form of worship. And, but again, you're not going to hear a message there that's uncomfortable. Not that every message needs to be uncomfortable, but this was a kind of church where you'll never feel an uncomfortable message. And our people would not have been comfortable there. One of them, in fact, voiced that opinion. And other churches in the state, I could recommend them for a lot of reasons, but there's always an extreme doctrine. So they're either extreme on the soul winning without repentance thing, or they're extreme on like the KJV only view, where they're basically Ruckmanites, but they won't admit it. Or they're extreme on the local church only view, where they're very intelligent sounding and very friendly, but there's just an extremeness to that doctrine there that creates some bad fruit. So all of these reasons, I'm thinking, boy, every church I'm looking at has kind of an extreme something, an extreme this or that. And I established a relationship with this man who was basically a very balanced individual. He would feel right at home on the Reason Together podcast. But he was 40 minutes away. Yeah. So I set up a meeting between that man and our remaining church members and myself. And we met at a neutral location, kind of halfway between our churches. And I told our people, ask this man whatever you'd like to ask him. Doctrinal, practical questions, whatever you want to ask him. Ask him about his background. Ask him what he thinks about this or that. And I told him, if he is a true shepherd, he will not be offended by you wanting to know.
Right.
He will not be offended by you questioning his views. He won't be. If he gets angry at you asking him a question about his doctrine or practice, that is not the man you want as a pastor. So we had a wonderful meeting together with the man, and the people really liked him. And that was sort of my attempt to sort of shepherd right up until the end there.
Yes, shepherd them to another shepherd.
Yeah.
So then, obviously, as you're still a congregation and you're a constituted church, do you just? You are legally recognized as a church. and you sense the Lord's leading me away, and not just me away as a pastor to where another pastor is going to come into this location, this flock, but rather I'm leading this flock to another shepherd. What do you do with that name of your church?
So it's a multi-step process where the remaining members have to actually vote to do this. There is a vote that is required to decommission
Is
a
that in
church.
your bylaws?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, it is. As well as essentially distributing the remaining assets. Excuse me, distributing those the right way. So you can't just have a yard sale and sell that stuff off and pocket the cash.
Yeah.
That stuff has to be donated to a church of like faith or a ministry of like faith, as far as the material goods goes. So we spent a while looking for other churches to give that stuff to, and we managed to find places for it all to go. And then remaining finances are used to pay whatever remaining bills there are of the church. And we did end up also distributing the final balance amongst the missionaries of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And that was it. I think the very last thing was just the other day we paid the final light bill, and that was it for the church account. So it has to be done by a process that is informed by the bylaws.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. One person had commented, I think, about your situation. I've never heard of that being done before. Well, we may not hear of that kind of transition much. However, when it is done, I don't know how many times it is done according to bylaws. How many times it is done to actually, if I could use the terminology, close up shop and do it correctly.
Yeah.
You don't just walk away from the building.
Sure.
Yeah.
I've heard horror stories about people coming in on a Sunday for church, just like any other Sunday, and the pastor gets up and announces we're closing next week.
Yeah.
No
preparation.
No official process. Nothing done above reproach or above board. It's just all, yep, we're done. And it's like, there's a reason why folks in our circles haven't heard of this happening this way, is because in most cases, it's just not done in an organized or legal or reputable fashion.
Good. And not good that it's not done that way, but I mean, yes. So then when you, do you call that a deconstitution, baby, basically?
Baby. There's different words.
That word came out wrong. Do you call that a deconstitution, baby? That's not what I meant to say.
I thought you said maybe. No. Maybe. So, no. I see what happened there. I've heard it called a formal dissolution.
Dissolution. There you go. Okay.
I've heard it called decommissioning or deconstituting a work. Any of those words is fine.
Okay. So with the dissolution, when you vote as a congregation to dissolve, then what is the, just quickly here, what is the follow-up to that regarding, say, the legal acknowledgement of your church? Okay. So obviously you're a 501c3 and
so with the Secretary of State, you usually have a filing with them annually. They recognize that your organization exists. It's literally as simple as going on to the Secretary of State's website and filing a dissolution notice.
Okay.
And they'll give you a certificate that it's official as of the date that you select. And then, of course, you have to contact your life insurance, or not life insurance, your liability insurance people, so that you're covered right up until that date.
Yep.
You have to contact your, in our case, we had a landlord because we leased the space and arrange for the final day, make sure all of the repairs and things are done that need to be. So you're in accordance with your lease and, schedule all your utilities to cease on that day, so you can schedule out your final bills and so on. There's a lot that goes into it, and on top of all this, you're trying to liquidate all of the assets to other places.
Right.
So.
Yes. Okay. Good. Well, that's a practical help. Now to go back to what to go back to not just the nuts and bolts of what you had to do, but the perceptions that are involved there. Any comment you want to make as far as how you, or maybe your family or your wife have handled it. Different people handle it differently. Some people are, I don't care what people think, but other people are more affected by that. And whether you care what people think or not, you still hear it sometimes.
Yeah.
Um, so have you run up against a variety of responses, and how do you deal with those?
Ooh. Well, the one I mentioned earlier was when someone said, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that," and they act like somebody died.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other response is, of course, disappointment, which is maybe a close cousin to that.
Disappointment by you or by others?
By others.
Okay.
Are you talking about my own personal feelings on it?
I could go both ways, but let's start with other people's take on it. They're disappointed with what they see, you're saying.
Yeah, they're disappointed with what they see. And the one guy said to me, and I almost hesitate to say it because it was like a compliment to me, and I don't want to compliment myself here, but try
No,
to
go ahead.
understand my spirit in saying it. He said, I understand this is what the Lord wants. This was a guy in our church, actually. He says, I understand what the Lord wants. It hurts to see someone who's good at something not do that something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that was his words, not mine.
Mm-hmm.
And I get that. I understand that feels a little disappointing, but I had nearly a decade to hone the gifts that God has given me that felt natural to me,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like administration, leadership, teaching, instruction, those things were natural to me. And honestly, I think the phase that we're entering now, I think the Lord wants me to hone the spiritual gifts that I'm not so natural at.
Mm-hmm.
Encouragement, mercy, being a prayer warrior for someone else. Those are things I struggle with a little more so than leadership, administration, and teaching. So honestly, I realize that people might be disappointed to say, oh, he's not doing that anymore. Yeah, but I think God is trying to help me hone my other gifts, and that's not just my gifts. I mean, it's the same for every Christian. You have gifts you're natural at, and you have others that you're not so natural at. And I feel like I have an opportunity now to really get good at the things that I'm not so naturally good at.
What a great perspective. And also by you now, coming under another pastor, and by that I don't mean that you're on staff, but that you're being shepherded. You have the opportunity to be what you wish you had.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that
Yes.
that you didn't have some folks that were that way, but like you're saying, you get to be a support and encouragement and a prayer for someone else, and
Yeah.
you understand much more deeply than your average bear what that pastor may be going through and what kind of praying and encouragement he might want and need at given
Yeah.
times.
Yeah. So yeah, that's I guess the part I'm looking forward to is getting good at the next thing.
Yeah.
As far as other perspectives that people have about it that I've gotten was the idea of quitting, that
Mm-hmm.
people view what we did as quitting. And again, this is a completely wrong perspective. The mission was accomplished. The mission was to bring the light of the gospel and to see fruit that remains. And that is what we did.
Mm-hmm.
There is fruit that remains there, and we brought the light of the gospel. So, uh, as far as quitting goes, people view not quitting as a virtue. But
Mm-hmm.
and usually that's how I am. So I'm one of those guys who stubbornly hangs on. In fact, we knew for probably 2+ years that the Lord was going to be moving us on. We just didn't know when.
Mm-hmm.
But I made no attempts to make that happen. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like I knew the Lord was going to move us on, but I was just content to just kind of plug my ears in, ignore that, and stay. And it did affect my health as a result.
Mm-hmm.
You know me, I worked like a dog. I slept very little for quite a while, and it affected my health. You wouldn't think that sleep can affect your health, or lack of sleep can affect your health that bad, but
Oh,
it does. It totally
yeah.
does. And
Yes.
stress levels, yeah, because it increases your cortisol and stress levels go up. And there's a
Hmm.
whole host of resulting things from cortisol that just mess you up. So um, when it comes to the idea of quitting, people who believe it's a virtue to not quit are forgetting a very important detail,
Hmm.
that it's not a virtue to stick it out if the Lord has lifted his hand from a thing.
Yes. Right.
There's no virtue in going further than the Lord is going to go.
Hmm. Hmm.
In fact, at that point, it's a vice. It's kind of
Foolish. Hmm.
stupid. It's foolish, yeah, brutish.
Yeah,
um,
and that whole concept plays on the idea that you quit something that you were supposed to do, and that's what we're saying is, in hindsight, it became clear. Oh, what I originally thought I wanted to do, or what the Lord was going to do, I'm realizing now. Okay, He's doing something a little differently, and
yep,
I can sense his being done, and thus my being done. It just the same way that they might say, well, you said that you were called to plant a church. Well, I was verbalizing the best I knew how. I thought
yep.
that's where God was going. Sometimes we feel like I'm going from A to C. He gets me to B and changes direction, and that's okay.
Yeah. Well, and two, part of it is, I don't think it's uncommon for the Lord to let you get a certain direction in life like that.
Sure, right.
Did the Lord call us to plant a church? Were we wrong in saying that originally? No, because that's what the Lord led us to believe. That is what he wanted us to believe then. And it's not that he changed his mind. It's just that he knows if he would have given me the goal of just going and bringing the gospel there, that I wouldn't have had a goal in mind. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Is that
Hmm.
making sense? Like the
Hmm.
Lord will sometimes let you have a goal for a while, even though that's not ultimately where he wants you to end up.
Well, and there may be some assumptions that we carry with it, to say,
Right.
um, and we've talked about this personally. This concept of a call. We say, well, He has called me, and so with the concept of a call, then I have to have a destination, and
Mm-hmm.
it has to be this one singular thing. Instead of I feel led to be a light bearer to those in
Yeah.
Connecticut, it's I feel called to X, and that X is planting a church. Well, you did, but the assumptions that go with that, and it's just it's not evil. It just is expected oftentimes by where we're at in our knowledge of things. The assumption is, like you kind of
Yeah.
mentioned earlier, well, that church is going to last, and it will grow, and it will become this, and it will become that. Well, that's all kind of assumptions. This was the direction I was headed. This is the thing I accomplished, and it may not
Yeah.
realize and materialize all the assumptions that I had with it.
Sure. I should take a moment to address also sort of the misperception that many Baptists have about vocational ministry. And it comes from a theological error, a hermeneutical error out of Romans 11. I think it's Romans 11:29. And I actually wrote an article on this years ago now
Mhm.
on the Reason Together site. I think it was years ago. Actually, no, I wrote it on my personal blog
Okay.
years ago. And then I think when we started the Reason Together blog, I just copied it over to that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's called Permanent Call versus Permanent Vocation. And
Mm-hmm.
people, will think, oh, Tom left full time ministry, but I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still in full time ministry just as I was before. There's just a difference now that I'm not vocationally in ministry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And my ministry looks a little different now. But every Christian is in full time ministry.
Should be.
And
Yep.
occasionally the Lord, yeah, they should be. Occasionally the Lord deploys one of those people to a vocational sense of ministry for a
Mm-hmm.
while. And that doesn't mean that he is locked in for life to vocational ministry, because we in our minds have separated vocational ministry as being of a higher quality, of a higher sort. than regular Christian service. And it really isn't. It really isn't. Qualitatively speaking, every person should be in full-time Christian ministry. And that's not going to look the same for everybody.
Right.
Obviously, if you're
Right.
working a regular job, you're not going to have the same amount of time to dedicate to, you know, making phone calls and, blitzing neighborhoods and making prospects. You're not going to have the same
Sure.
amount of time as a pastor will who does this vocationally. But when you're on your job and you give the gospel to your coworker, or you tell them you're going to pray for them, and you become essentially the pastor of your workplace,
Hmm.
which I have been called, right? That's what led me into the ministry originally. Was I was known as sort of a pastor of my workplace, because I was always talking about the things of God at Hannibal Regional Hospital. And I
Mhm.
became known for that. And eventually I said, you know what? I enjoy that more than my actual job.
Mm.
And the Lord used that to lead me into vocational ministry. But I'm still in ministry now. It's just not vocational. And my
Yes.
ministry
Right.
now is one in which I am a prayer supporter for a couple of pastors. And I give the ministry of my presence, because I know what that does for a pastor in a church when
Mm.
you're not there. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm making sure that
Mm-hmm.
I'm there, and
The
I'm
ministry
trying
of your
to
presence.
help. Yeah, the ministry of presence is underrated, but I think more people need to be called to the ministry of being a good church member.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Good.
And
Um,
that is what our ministry is now.
is there are there ways that you felt that you needed to protect your wife or kids in the transition?
Huh. Yes, I know that there are, and I suppose I haven't really yet verbalized them to myself in a categorized way like you're asking.
Okay.
So it's a little hard to put my finger on,
Okay.
but honestly, I don't feel like we had to protect ourselves from any sort of problem with the people from our own church.
Right. Right.
They understood. They
Mm-hmm.
got it. Like I said, I think any church would love to have those people in their church. They understood. Really, the number one way to try and protect my family is to do what I'm doing now, is to explain this, because
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the primary threat to my family is really from people who don't understand
Mm-hmm.
real ministry. People who sit in Baptist churches hearing that, the gifts and calling of God are without repentance, and then they see some preacher leave a church plant. Well, they're going to look at our whole family sideways now.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like in many ways doing what I'm doing now is the best protection I can offer to my family, is to help try and change the stigma behind that in our circles that comes from poor theology. Um, so I don't know. Is that
I,
kind of what you're getting at, or you thinking of something else?
well, I didn't have a specific in mind, but I think that's a good answer. And I feel like if our listeners could get the idea of the fluid motion of surrender,
Mm-hmm.
that your life, when you're giving your testimony to someone and you say, I had the privilege for 9 years of working vocationally in the ministry in Connecticut, and what a blessing that was. And that's just a part of who I am and what I'm doing now. I'm doing something different. It wasn't I launched out and I failed and now I'm doing something else. No, it's just a part of who you were and what God was leading you to do. That was a neat opportunity. You put
Yeah.
your heart and soul into it and you grew because of it. You're a better man. There's people whose lives are changed, and on you
Yeah.
move to do whatever else the Lord wants you to do. And
Yeah.
that can be I would imagine that can be liberating, and that whole perspective of just continued joy and surrender to God's leadership, even if it is different than the stereotype or different than our assumptions or
Right.
different than what we expected.
Right. And, the way I think of it is like tours or deployments in the military, right?
Yeah.
Those guys will get called up and they'll get on an airplane in the middle of the night and they'll be flown halfway around the world and they'll be there for so many weeks, months, maybe even years, and then they come back. And then they wait a while, and then the Lord the U.S. government deploys them somewhere else, and so on. And it's almost like tours, as it
Yeah.
were. And I think that is how it often is in ministry for people who are surrendered. Is that the Lord knows that He can call that person to do whatever, and they'll do it.
That's neat. That's
And
neat.
and He occasionally just deploys them differently.
And to take a similar illustration, I think about, some people have what we call maybe a military career, or
Mm-hmm.
they are career military. That is, they stay in for 30 years. That's their thing. They've decided that's, anyway, not to draw the illustration too far. Other people do their 8-year stint. And, when somebody does their 8 years and they say, I'm done and I'm doing something else, we don't go, oh, so you failed in the military. No, they did what they signed up to do and they're done unless they get dishonorably discharged. They gained experience. They move on in life. They're stronger because of it. We respect their service. And other people stay in for 30 years. You know what I mean?
Well, and even those people, they're not doing the same thing the whole 30 years.
No, right.
They are sent to different places to do different things. My wife and I have a mutual agreement. It is often unspoken, but it is an agreement that we have that we follow the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever He wants us to do, that is what we do. Where He wants us to go, that is where we go. And we followed the Lord to Pennsylvania when we first got married. We followed Him to Missouri. We followed Him to Connecticut. And we followed Him now here to Tennessee. We know that every single one of those moves, as tumultuous as a move is, we knew that every single one of them is what the Lord wanted. We know that. We knew it then, we know it now. And we know the same about this move. This is what the Lord wanted. We are people that follow the Lord where He wants us to go, period. And we have full confidence that whatever He wants us to do here, we're going to do it. We don't know what all those things are yet. Right now, we're simply in the full-time ministry of being at a church and just being present and being prayer supporters to the pastors there and just being kind of that unspoken, hey, I know you're bearing burdens you're not telling people about. Hey, I know what you're going through and I'm praying for you about that. Just being that for another couple of pastors. It feels so good. There's so much joy in that. And I'm excited about this phase of our full-time service.
Great. Well, listeners, if you have any questions in particular, maybe you're curious about, or if it's been a peculiar blessing, maybe to hear the perspective, we'd like to hear your thoughts. reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. As always, we open it to any question you might be having. Say, what does the scripture talk about this? What about this aspect of life? Certainly, we want to hear those as well. But any question, any thought that you have, and maybe you've come from a similar background, a similar experience, something you want to add. Maybe it's not. As we said at the outset, this could hit different people different ways. Somebody who's been through something similar, somebody who is in ministry, not in ministry, thinking about ministry. There's a lot to be gleaned here. We look forward to hearing from you. reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. And I want to thank Tom for being open enough to just take the entire episode and after show here to convey to us some of this transition in his own life. And so, Tom, anything you want to finish with?
No, just thank you for listening. Thank you for the good questions. And thank you to the listeners for understanding that this is a little different of a normal episode that we have. But we'll be back to our regularly scheduled programming next time.
Yeah.
For now, I guess we are encouraging balance, developing perspective, and connecting faith to practice. This is Reason Together.